Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. As ever, we are, or as is so often the case, Bernard, we're going to be discussing the travails of Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour government, because ashes to ashes, dust to dust, if events don't get you, the future must. The first, 8 months it is now of the new government's life have been difficult. But I'm delighted to say that we're joined by a guest today, Patrick Maguire, who is one half of the authorial duo who have written a new book, Get In, the inside story of Labour under Starmer. I'm holding it up for those of you who are watching on YouTube. Those of you listening on your phones will just have to imagine this splendid scene. So it's written by Patrick Maguire of The Times and Gabriel Pogrund of The Sunday Times, two of the finest young political journalists in Britain today. And I say that not just because I too, of course, serve at Rupert Murdoch's pleasure.
I thought you were going to say it's because you're young.
A tremendous book, written with great brio and panache. It rather reminded me at times of Tom Holland's Histories of Imperial Rome. It is written with great pace, attention to detail, and it asks some of the same questions, perhaps, as Histories of Imperial Rome do. You know, who is the emperor and who is it that is advising him? Because the two dominant figures in Get In are Sir Keir Starmer, obviously, the Prime Minister, the man who has brought the Labour Party back to power just one term after it suffered its worst defeat in a century, and Morgan McSweeney, the Irishman, as Patrick and Gabriel refer to him, Keir Starmer's closest advisor, political strategist, and someone who I suppose the British public still don't know very much about. So Bernard, all that having sort of set some of the sort of scenery for our discussion today, perhaps you kick us off by welcoming Patrick to the programme and asking him our first question.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Patrick. Absolute pleasure to have you on. Let's first of all start, before we get into the machinations of how Starmer got the leadership and what those who were around him in his kitchen cabinet were doing in terms of being on manoeuvres. Let's start with Starmer's politics itself. That would seem to be the right place to start. And there's a passage in the book which Tony Blair denies, but even if he does, it does seem to encapsulate the issue with Keir Starmer, which is what is his politics. For example, you say, or Blair purportedly says, the plus side is he's intelligent, decent. He's not Ed Miliband or Neil Kinnock. He's not a nutcase like Gordon Brown, but he's not John Smith either. I mean, he's like John Smith, but without his class. He's basically a London human rights lawyer who's not in touch with the people. He's perceived as an over-smooth, lawyer-like person, too soft, not tough enough, inexperienced. Now, if Blair did say that, he's ringing alarm bells very loudly, but it does beg the question, what is Keir Starmer's politics?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. And secondly, you can tell why Tony Blair denied that contemporaneous note recorded in a friend's diary, because it manages to insult just about everybody he's ever worked with, and indeed the current leader of the Labour Party. But I think Blair does get to the heart of the unknowability of Keir Starmer, the politician. I mean, if we were talking about Keir Starmer, the human rights lawyer, we could very easily come to a firm and succinct conclusion about his worldview, what he thinks the role of the law is. As a politician, a relatively inexperienced politician, let's remember, not even been a member of parliament for 10 years, now he's Prime Minister, that question is much harder to answer. And I think that Blair quote gets the heart of it. The other Blair quote, which thankfully is something he told us on the record, as opposed to being recounted by someone else, I think gets a large part of the way as well. He said, it's wrong to think about Keir Starmer's journey as a Kinnockite journey from the left to the centre. In Blair's words, Keir didn't start anywhere apart from vaguely progressive. Now, once you sort of have that as your conceptual framework, a lot of the stuff that doesn't make sense outwardly about Keir Starmer, or the left would call cynical, begins to make a bit more sense. You know, he comes into Parliament with a broad not particularly deep understanding of what he thinks progressive politics is for. He's been a lawyer railing against the system from the outside, as he once told me, and he thought, I need to hold executive power. But to what end? And that was always the question he hadn't really thought about. But he knew that, to put it perhaps a little bit disparagingly, he was in favour of a political system, political parties that did good things and against those that did bad things. So you can see why he arrives as Labour leader in 2020, situated somewhere on the soft left or the mushy middle of the Parliamentary Labour Party, sort of at peace with the economic radicalism of Corbyn, making those 10 pledges to the Labour membership that were all sort of diet Corbynism, and sincerely believing that his job was to unify the Labour Party, and in the words of Morgan McSweeney, saying to the Labour Party, let's all be friends. But it's those two words from Blair, vaguely progressive, that I think get to the heart of it. And his political formation, unusually for a leader of the Labour Party, his triangulations and the refinement of his politics have taken place in real time as Labour leader, as opposed to, writing pamphlets from the backbenches or spending a long time as an activist. So vaguely progressive, I think, puts our finger on it as a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, David Cameron was once asked, so it was reported, why do you want to be Prime Minister? And he said rather glibly, but in typical Cameron style, well, because I think I'd be rather good at it. Now, Keir Starmer wouldn't put it in those terms, but one of the things that is quite clear from your book and indeed from other accounts, but comes through very strongly, is that Keir Starmer wants to be in Parliament because Parliament is where true power rests, and that he's not content with being a member of the shadow cabinet. He wouldn't actually be content with being Lord Chancellor. He wants to be Prime Minister. And yet, it's interesting that both you and Bernard have cited on a couple of quotations from Tony Blair in the book. I was actually going to bring one or other of them up too, because I think they're both very significant. But there's this other line from Starmer where he says, and you quote him, I don't have any ideology at all. There's no such thing as Starmerism, and there never will be. Now that is quite a thing for somebody who wants to be Prime Minister to say. It's quite unusual, I think. I mean, even David Cameron, who was not of any great fixed abode ideologically, but would have been able to come up with an answer as to what his political persona was about, what it was he wanted to achieve in office. And yet Starmer explicitly rejects not just the idea of Starmerism, but the whole concept of Starmerism. And so if you do that, then a natural question that follows on from that is, well, if there is no such thing as Starmerism, then what in the end is Keir Starmer actually for, beyond holding power for what? The sake of power and because he's a good sort and people of good sort and good character like him ought to have power?
Well, that's the question we put to so many people who know Keir Starmer well and have worked with Keir Starmer. Now, some of them from that early phase would say, no, the stuff he was talking about in 2020 is the stuff he actually believes. It's not anything that's been retrofitted onto him by people on the right of the Labour Party or the Blairites in the Labour Party. But it's that aversion to the ism. And, that's really unusual, by the way, by the standards of the Labour Party in particular. We talk about not just Blairism and Brownism. This is a party where we talk about Crosslandism or Benism, or people could, speak to you for hours on end about what Peter Shaw believed. This is a party that is obsessed with even the most minor players' conception of the world and what socialism and social democracy can be. But Keir Starmer, as you say, abhors that. When the left accuse him of it, he is genuinely horrified and baffled, because that to him is not what politics is. Now, certainly in the early phase of our story, there is a degree of that Cameron mindset about him. He genuinely believes, as was the case at the Crown Prosecution Service, that if he can run things better, that if he can demand basic standards of competence and efficiency, that if he can, chair meetings more efficiently than Jeremy Corbyn could, things will run more smoothly, because ultimately we're all around the same table and we believe the same thing, because we're Labour politicians, and that's that. But it's difficult beyond that to sketch out what he believes. I mean, later on, we talk about his 5 missions for government, and that was as late as 2022, 2023. It's remarkable, those 5 missions, that you had people like Peter Hyman, the former Blair advisor, basically parachuted in to say to Keir Starmer, okay, we're coming into land here. What is it you actually believe? How should we articulate this in your voice? Because that's something you haven't done yet. And although we're sort of freewheeling into power by default here, you haven't really told us what you're about. And there's a quote from Peter Hyman, again on the record, saying, Keir Starmer's a very experiential even leader. He would sort of grasp problems in the abstract or struggle to get animated about them in the same way that a lot of Labour politicians do, until, for instance, he'd gone to Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool and seen children under general anaesthetic because they couldn't afford dental care and they had to have rotten teeth pulled out, which is, in some respects, very admirable. And you get a sense of the sort of burning indignation of Keir Starmer at sort of inequality in those moments. But it's never something he articulates from first principles, which is why, a couple of people in the Labour Party have read our book and they've said, we really enjoyed it, but I got to the end of this not really knowing what any of it was for. And
but after 400 pages, that's a bit disappointing.
But also, I mean, it's something we felt when we finished it. We sort of thought, it's a comprehensive guide to what happened and how it happened and why other people wanted to do it. But beyond being in power, being behind the desk, being the guy who can make things more efficient and run things more competently, what does he want? And it's very telling that throughout this book, it's other people who fill in those gaps for him.
And Patrick, I mean, there's perhaps a tendency for people on the left, and indeed commentators who comment on the left, to always, when it comes to Labour politics, to try and pin a Labour leader on the ideological spectrum. And arguably, quite a lot of Labour leaders have not been overtly ideological. I mean, Clement Attlee described himself as a little left of centre. Gatesko perhaps was a bit more ideological, and of course he had Crosland by his side in a sense to give him some intellectual oomph for what he wanted to do. Harold Wilson, actually perhaps not very, very ideological. Jim Callaghan not. Michael Foot perhaps more so, the old romantic. Kinnock, also a younger romantic who jettisoned everything he believed when it came crashing down on the altar of reality. John Smith, probably a little bit of a Gateskielite. But I'll tell you what all of these Labour leaders had in common. Even Tony Blair, for a by-election in Beaconsfield and wore the odd CND badge in Islington back in the day when it was fashionable. They had some sort of hinterland. They had some sort of anchors. And whilst it's perhaps not a bad thing that you're not overly ideological, if you have no appreciation of party, if you have no appreciation of movement, if you have no appreciation what Harold Wilson used to refer to as our people in the country, if there's nothing there that fires you, events will dictate you rather than you dictate events. And therefore, it begs a very obvious question. Isn't there a sequel to this book which will be called Get Out?
Well, the two suggestions we've had for the title of the sequel are Get Out and Fuck Off, which we'll wait to see how bad, if indeed it happens, the defeat is in 2029 before we decide on which. But I think you're absolutely right about hinterland and that sense of grounding, be it intellectual or political, and that sense of romance that's inherent in the Labour Party. I mean, there's one of my favourite scenes, and I couldn't believe this when we were told it by one of the small number of people in the meeting, because I thought, if I wrote this as satire, I'd think it was too unsubtle. It's sort of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and a couple of others talking about their summer reading, and conversation turns to Philip Short's new biography of Francois Mitterrand, and Pat McFadden and Rachel Reeves and others are very excited about this, and they say, "Oh, give me the name of the author, give me the title of the book," and the conversation turns to Keir Starmer, who sort of shrugs and says, "Oh, I prefer to read Victoria Hislop on the beach." And it's that sort of disdain for the stuff that lots of people in the late, all those people you mentioned would at some level, they'd at least be conversant in it. Whereas those conversations make Keir Starmer fall asleep and say, "No, thank you. I'm off to the pub to watch Arsenal," which in some ways probably makes him more in tune with a lot of traditional Labour voters. But at the same time, it's that lack of, as you say, the conception of our people and what it's all for that makes it difficult. And I do think the arc of this story, Keir Starmer is constantly defined by events. And he's something of a political opportunist in that he sort of stumbles accidentally into a series of positions and situations from which he then takes advantage and uses for definition. But for instance, the biggest one perhaps would be the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, but he doesn't go into that thinking this is the moment for a era-defining and conclusive break with the left. People around him do, not immediately, but Keir Starmer himself, that's the context in which he says there's no such thing as Starmerism. He's not round the table with Len McCluskey saying, you guys have absolutely blown it now. I was reaching an uneasy accommodation with you for reasons of, realpolitik, but that's it. It's no, guys, we don't mean this. He's on a tour of the leaders of the hard left saying this isn't ideological. This is, about the rule book of the Labour Party. It's only as time goes on that he, uses that to give himself political definition and draw an ideological and political line. Ditto the Hartlepool by-election, which was the spur for, again, the acceleration of that process to move Labour away from the activist left and focus on voters in what we probably still call the red wall of English politics. But again, the day after that, he's saying, I'm going to quit. This is all doomed. And for a long period, they're sort of muddling through. So you're right that he's buffeted by events constantly. I don't know whether he had the good luck or whether it was, that he often, because of his disdain for politics, doesn't do the political thing. He's quite prepared to take blunt advice from other people because he's not thinking, oh, well, the political solution to this is X or Y. I mean, there were two options he had after the Hartlepool by-election. The other one, as outlined for us by members of his inner circle, was he could have, for instance, gone back to first principles. There was a moment he had Michael Marmot, the academic and inequality expert, into the shadow cabinet in 2020, talking about inequality, and was saying to the shadow cabinet, Keir Starmer, this is what we base our manifesto around. This is my politics. So there's just as easily another world in which he takes the wrong decision in response to events. He retreats to the base, and Labour, ends up shrivelling and losing, and sort of becomes a shadow of the party it is now, or becomes a sort of more Ed Milibandy looking party. But it's only sort of happenstance and good luck that has meant, for now, as you say, events, certainly in opposition, allowed himself to find himself in tune with the voters. But that wasn't a given. That's a case of, good luck and good luck and happenstance.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose all successful politicians in opposition require a degree of good fortune and the ability to capitalise on events that were not of their own making or construction. But you're right, I think, Patrick, that Starmer is a sort of outline that other people fill in. And one of the things that comes across in the book very, very clearly, obviously, is the importance of Morgan McSweeney to Starmer's journey into power. And one of the other things that is quite clear, Sonia, is you have the people around Jeremy Corbyn very firmly of the view that there was effectively a conspiracy to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. And I suppose Morgan McSweeney would say, well, damn straight there was. And I led it, and it was necessary. There's always a temptation, I suppose, for political outsiders or pundits, commentators, analysts, and so on to grant too much authority or brilliance to the Svengali, the advisor, the power behind the throne. Whether it's Dominic Cummings, obviously, with Boris Johnson, or Steve Hilton for a while with David Cameron, Karl Rove with George Bush. A whole range of people over the years. a lot of political journalism gets very fixated on these people. Um, but they are important. And Morgan McSweeney is somebody who is extremely important to the modern history of the Labour Party, but is somebody about whom I would guess 19 out of 20, maybe more than that, members of the general public could tell you almost nothing about. And I dare say that Morgan McSweeney is quite happy about that. But could you tell us a bit about him, where he comes from, what he believes in? Because one of the other interesting things in your book, as it seems to me, is that it's quite clear what Morgan McSweeney believes in, and the kind of Labour Party and a Labour government that he wants to see. And it's not always clear to me that that this maps neatly or completely onto what Keir Starmer believes and the sort of Labour government that he would like to see were he given a free hand. So where does McSweeney come from? How does he get involved with Starmer? How important is he to Starmer? I mean, as much as could Starmer have become leader without Morgan McSweeney? And what happens next?
It's unfortunate for us that there is that trope you identify in political writing where the advisor, the Svengali, assumes that level of importance, because I think that is definitely the case in this book, but not to sound too defensive. This is sort of, a couple of reviewers have pointed this out. It's because of the unique way the McSweeney-Starmer relationship is configured. I mean, Morgan McSweeney was doing this. His story begins much, much earlier than Keir Starmer begins to think seriously about Labour politics and elected politics. I mean, to answer sort of chronologically, Morgan McSweeney comes quite literally from Macroom, which is a small town in West Cork. He, from a lower middle class or solidly middle class family. But the crucial thing in his political identity was that Macroom, West Cork is or was for the large part Fine Gael country. And to grow up as the son of a Fine Gael family, his aunt was a councillor, his cousin was an advisor to the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar. He's very much part of, rural Cork's petty bourgeois. He is at sort of a degrees remove from the way politics in Ireland was working at the time, i.e. the Gombe men of Fianna Fáil, they were the predominant party post-independence, of course, for so long. They had the money, they had the patronage, they had the public appointments. And that breeds in, Fine Gael people a degree of, I think, resentment, a degree of, rage at the way politics in Ireland, particularly rural Ireland, is so often corrupt and corruptible. And that was the sort of the world which Morgan McSweeney grew up in. But he wasn't particularly interested in politics. His cousins and his aunts and his parents would be out canvassing for Garrett Fitzgerald's candidates, and he'd be, at the wall with his hurl and schlitter, bouncing it up against the garage wall. He'd be following Liverpool FC fanatically. He wasn't interested in politics. He was, by his own admission, a bit of a slacker, and he did, as so many Irishmen do, left for London, bounced around, worked dead-end jobs, laboured on building sites, went to work on a kibbutz, went to stay with his uncle, who was a priest in a presbytery in California, and never really knew what he wanted to do. But the formative experience for him was when he went back to London, having dropped out of university, and went back to Middlesex University to study politics and marketing. And he ended up, on a work experience placement at the Millbank Tower, working for the Labour Party, working as a sort of intern on one of Peter Mandelson's attack teams. Peter Mandelson, by the way, never remembered him, despite being written up as a great Mandelson protege. Morgan McSweeney used to work on reception at Millbank, and Peter Mandelson and the royalty of New Labour would walk past, never uttering a word to him. In Tony Blair's words, Peter might have ignored Morgan then, but he doesn't now. And Morgan McSweeney, he's working for the Labour Party, and he's finally sent out into the country as an organiser at a time when the gilded sons of New Labour, the golden generation, all have jobs on Whitehall. They're special advisors, they're ministers, they're joining the cabinet. Morgan McSweeney, he's a little bit younger, but sort of their generation, is heading out into a Britain that's falling out in love with New Labour. He's fighting in North Wales as people struggle to get excited about the Welsh Assembly. His first parliamentary campaign is in Brent East, when the Lib Dems win on the back of discontent with Iraq. He's there when Labour lose Hammersmith in 2005. He goes to Lambeth, and this is one of his big formative experiences, when both the hard left under Ted Knight, who oversaw a child abuse scandal in the borough's children's homes, and a Blairite council have both lost power, and people are looking at the Labour Party saying, you don't represent me at all. And that's just as true for New Labour as it is the hard left, and that's something that's overlooked about McSweeney. He goes to Barking and Dagenham, where Labour is losing to the BNP. And over time, he forms this idea that, the Labour Party is too busy talking to itself. It's forgotten that cardinal rule of politics, knowing the voter and crucially knowing that, you have to count their votes at the end of the day and you have to have more than the other party. And both the hard left and New Labour between them have become isolated and estranged from their own voters. And by the mid-2010s, Morgan McSweeney is setting up this secretive think tank called Labour Together and looking at the Corbyn disaster as he sees it, and he's thinking everybody's losing their minds. Jeremy Corbyn is not speaking to the voter in the country, but my friends on the right of the Labour Party are not speaking to the voters who will decide the future of the Labour Party, twice over now. And he knew this very well, having run Liz Kendall's leadership campaign, which of course won 4.5% of the vote against Jeremy Corbyn. He knows that the right of the Labour Party is not taking the members at their word or meeting them halfway or treating their views as legitimate. When they hear anti-austerity politics or opposition to foreign wars, they think you're nutjob Trotskyists and you're Marxists and you're entryist, which was never true of the bulk of the Labour membership. And so with a lot of money from sympathetic donors, he does a big MRI scan, a huge amount of polling for years and years on the Labour membership. And the point of that is twofold. The first is to sort of identify a politics that splits the difference between Blairism and Corbynism and to find a policy agenda, or a sort of ideological terrain on which to build a new Labour Party. But that's secondary in importance to the imperative to find the person who is going to beat Jeremy Corbyn at the next leadership election. And Keir Starmer doesn't know this at the time, but as early as 2017, Morgan McSweeney's polling is saying there is one guy who's in that sweet spot, and it's Keir Starmer. Now, there is no way to write this story then that does not have Morgan McSweeney coming first, because all of that comes before Keir Starmer is in Parliament and starts planning seriously for the Labour leadership in 2019. I mean, he's thinking about it deeply from the moment he gets there in 2015, but it's only in 2019 he starts planning every week. And Morgan McSweeney, for years before that, one, has come up with this analysis of where the Labour Party is going wrong, two, built the infrastructure and raised the money to work out what to do about it, and three, and this is awkward for everybody involved, Morgan McSweeney recruits Keir Starmer. He picks Keir Starmer, not the other way around. I mean, it's Keir Starmer who ultimately says, yes, come aboard in the summer of 2019. But that is because Morgan McSweeney comes to Keir Starmer and says, I have a ready-made formula to make you leader of the Labour Party. And I've studied all of this stuff and you're the guy to do it. So while people say, some reviewers have said, we want more on Keir Starmer. Why is this the Morgan McSweeney story with Keir Starmer as a supporting actor? It's because that's what happened. That's what it was. That's how we got here.
What you're describing there is perhaps an individual who exercises more authority over a Labour Prime Minister than just about anyone in the history of Labour governments. I mean, Wilson famously had his kitchen cabinet, and there's a lot which has been written about just how much did Marcia Williams exercise over the Prime Minister. I mean, Wilson, when Joe Haynes wrote his first book, gave a very lengthy interview to Lou Gardner of Thames Television, setting out the limits of what Marcia Williams actually did for him. But of course, what she had, and this gets back to having anchors in the Labour Party and the Labour movement. She worked at Transport House in the 1950s. She had impeccable contacts within the party and the country, full-time agents, trade unions, and so on. If you look at the Alistair Campbell relationship with Blair, it was symbiotic. Campbell didn't have to run things past Blair because he instinctively knew how he would think about an issue and therefore could make a comment on his behalf. But again, Campbell, I would suggest, has some serious roots within the party. And I've always regarded Campbell actually as as essentially actually old Labour who makes a whole load of excuses for Tony Blair, and therefore he's pigeonholed as irredeemably new Labour. What you're describing here is someone who appears to have sort of fallen in to politics, who again doesn't appear to have terribly many anchors within the party, and is sort of groping his way through opinion polling, trying to find out what he believes before he can tell his boss what he should believe. And I think Labour people who are trying to understand what has gone wrong so early on. It was always going to be difficult for Labour. It was always going to get difficult fairly early on. But people are saying, what's actually gone wrong? Well, we have a prime minister who's not only not ideological, he has no real anchors, but the eminence grise doesn't appear to be a clever strategist either, apart from he knows how to get his man in.
I think, look, that's a criticism I think even friends of Morgan McSweeney would say would have some truth in it, particularly on working out what to think and polling. I was having lunch with a very good friend of his yesterday who said, wearily, sort of Morgan was allergic to policy until he went into Downing Street and had to confront it every day. Now, on the point about him not being anchored in the Labour Party, maybe that's a little bit unfair. This is a guy who spent his entire adult life in Labour activism, but it's certainly true that one could say that of a lot of people. And we know very, very clearly what Morgan McSweeney doesn't like, or what he defines himself in opposition to. The indulgence of the hard left, a liberal strain in Labour's thinking that is equally at odds with, and in its own way, extremist on some points relative to the sort of median of the Labour Party. But I think there's a lot of truth in what you say, and that's the difficult thing as well for the many, many people we spoke to who admire, venerate, lionize Morgan McSweeney, who would say in a heartbeat that their ultimate loyalty is to him rather than the Prime Minister if they were forced to choose from the proverbial burning building. What does he believe? What is it for? I mean, you can say it's blue Labour, more communitarian. Again, you can retrofit other people's ideas onto it. But, I'm not sure there is necessarily a McSweeney-ism either, beyond as a theory of winning elections and campaigning and what you should and shouldn't say to voters. I mean, there's a journalist there's a journalist called Morgan Jones who I always am careful to cite when I use the phrase I'm about to use, because it's one of those that's so good I wish I came up with it myself. But throughout this story, there are lots of people who you would call Clause 1 socialists. Now, Clause 1 of the Labour Party constitution is about existing to win elections. And the key people in this book, who are the people to whom Keir Starmer turns, who are responsible for its leadership, for his leadership victory, for the mechanics of winning a general election. It's people like Morgan McSweeney. It's people like Holly Ridley, who's now General Secretary of the Labour Party. Very tough and hard-nosed shadow cabinet ministers like Shabana Mahmood. None of these people are necessarily big reforming Labour thinkers. They are people who are concerned primarily with Labour winning an election. And that almost is an end in itself. And funnily enough, actually, that gets us to a place where that's probably something they have in common with Keir Starmer, despite the gulf in how they view and perceive the world and how interested they are in the stuff of politics itself.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is always interesting, and I think for some outsiders baffling and perplexing about the Labour Party, is the way that everything sort of folds back on itself. The ghosts of Labour history are always present. I mean, almost no Labour leaders win elections from opposition. I mean, you have Attlee, Wilson, Blair, now Starmer. You're talking about Morgan McSweeney and his little think tank, pressure group, activist group inside the party, Labour Together. I was delighted to read, because I knew it would please Bernard, that the very first person who gave money to Labour Together was Bernard Donahue, one of Harold Wilson's closest advisors and confidants. So again, it's that same question. If you're always being born back into the past, but I think we should also talk a little bit, if we can, Patrick, about Scotland. McSweeney was very quick to be of the view that there was no path back to Downing Street that didn't run through Scotland. And it's also, I think, been the case that viewed from Scotland, there is no path back to respectability at Holyrood that didn't run through Downing Street first for the Labour Party. McSweeney, whose wife is, of course, now an MP for Hamilton and Clyde Valley, Imogen Walker. Although I think they first met when she was a councillor in South London. But he dubbed it the Scotland part of his project, Project Lazarus, which was to be distinguished from Project Phoenix, which was the bit at for England, I suppose, and particularly the north of England and the Midlands, perhaps. Could you tell us a bit about Project Lazarus and is there an awareness in Downing Street to the same degree there certainly is in the Scottish Labour Party that although Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will not have to face the electorate until 2028 or 2029 and therefore have a bit of time when it comes to advancing government goals and objectives and policy and waiting for growth to come along and save their bacon and all the rest of it, for Anas Sarwar and the Scottish Labour Party, they do not have that time. They must go to the polls in, less than 18 months now, May of next year for the next Scottish parliamentary elections. And the opinion polls are currently absolutely brutal for the Scottish Labour Party. And there's, I think it's fair to say, a consensus emerging in Scottish politics that although Anas Sarwar may have made mistakes himself, the greater part of the responsibility for Labour's predicament in Scotland right now, which as the current polls would suggest would have them on about 18% of the constituency vote, the worst ever result for Labour in the history of the Scottish Parliament, if that were to be confirmed or repeated next May. There's, as I say, an emerging consensus that most of the responsibility for Scottish Labour's current difficulties actually stems from Westminster and Whitehall and from the leadership, from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
I think that's certainly true. And although Morgan McSweeney very early on in our book is talking, as you say, about Project Lazarus, the need to revive the Labour Party in Scotland as a viable electoral force at Westminster, it's certainly true that for a long time, that's all at a degree's remove from the main business of the Labour Party in Westminster. I mean, 'twas ever thus, of course, if you are, Joanne Lamont, you are nodding furiously at this point. But Project Lazarus, was exactly what it says in the tin, bringing it back from the dead. And the first thing, of course, they needed to do was get rid of Richard Leonard. And again, you see an early sign of McSweeney seeing things with clarity that Starmer doesn't necessarily. McSweeney spends a whole lot of time and effort trying to wrest back control of the Scottish Labour Party. He tries to get rid of Michael Sharp, the Secretary General of Scottish Labour, and eventually does. And Richard Leonard is next. He gets Gary Smith of the GMB to, read him the last rites or say to Richard Leonard, of course, himself a former GMB official, his wife's a GMB official, and say, look, Richard, your time is up. But when they're having these conversations, and this at a time when Starmer's leadership is very unstable and the unions would have been forgiven for looking elsewhere and saying, what's the point of any of this? When they first have that conversation, Morgan McSweeney says to Keir Starmer, let's get rid of Richard Leonard. And Keir Starmer sort of is a little bit taken aback and says, well, can't we put him on a performance plan? And we say in the book that's sort of like
political steroids would be required for that.
Well, no, it was sort of if you are a sales rep not hitting your KPIs, it was. And we said, what was on this performance plan? Where we asked people familiar with this, and they said, oh, it was stuff like do more press releases and make sure you're in the media a bit more. And and again, that's an early sign of Keir Starmer perhaps not grasping political imperatives like Morgan McSweeney does. But they get rid of Richard Leonard. Anas Sarwar comes back in. But what's interesting, again, if we wrote the book again, this would be probably a richer scene. But what's interesting is Anas Sarwar spends a lot of time trying and failing to convince people in Westminster that they should bother. There are people inside Keir Starmer's office who basically take the view, look, it's done, it's dead. We might, like in 2017, win half a dozen or more seats on a fluke of polling, but come on, what's the point? It takes Anas Sarwar going to Westminster and saying, look, here's the back of the fag packet maths about my increasing vote and seat share and what you need to do in England. And Morgan McSweeney takes some convincing, but he gets that, not least because of his wife's ambitions and the fact they live in a nice house just outside of Lanark. So that takes a lot of time in doing, and I think it's not insignificant that some of the people Morgan McSweeney listens to most and is most reliant on politically, people like Gary Smith, people like Christina McAnay of the GMB and Unison, respectively, are themselves Scots. So know whereof they speak, and of course he lives in Scotland. And Anna Sarwar eventually got the money. Keir Starmer, going to Scotland every month, but that took a lot of time. It wasn't a given. From McSweeney saying Project Lazarus in 2020, that becoming part of the stuff and the rhythm of Labour in opposition took a good 3 or 4 years. And now here we are in government. I mean, Anna Sarwar is still, a semi-regular presence in Westminster. I saw him recently, and you guys know him, very chipper, very very upbeat. But I think there is an awareness too that the Scottish Labour Party now very well resourced, given a lot of cash and resources by the party centrally. But I think we all know that Scottish MPs are looking at particularly the Treasury and saying, we need a course correction pretty soon, or, we need to see the fruits of Anna Sarwar coming in and out of the Treasury every time he goes to London, or, being on speaking terms and being able to pick up the phone to the cabinet whenever they want, if we are to turn this around. Now, a lot of that, of course, is beyond the power and influence of Anna Sarwar. I mean, he's listened to, of course. He has the ear of everybody involved. But these are ultimately, for the most part, English ministers making decisions that primarily affect England. Morgan McSweeney and the energy, and Morgan McSweeney's energy and that of strategist number 10, who are setting the political direction and tone of this government, is now absorbed by Nigel Farage. So while there is definitely an awareness that the elections in 2026 at Holyrood are going to be a big, big moment, and they will secondarily have an impact on what the arithmetic in 2029 is likely to be, it's going to take quite a lot. Anas is going to have to summon all of his charm and influence to keep people's eyes on that, because Farage is knocking at the door. There's another set of devolved elections the same day in Wales where Farage is the big threat. So while there certainly is an awareness, in large part due to Anna Sarwar building that sort of pan-UK political consciousness and keeping himself in there, and Morgan McSweeney getting that it's important, you can never really bet the house on people in London saying, yeah, it's important, but ultimately something else is more important. And if you were to press me, maybe that's a nice to have and not an essential, which I personally think would be a mistake, but we'll see.
I mean, it's perfectly possible that Labour could tank in 2026 in Scotland. And if the economy did turn around UK-wise and the fiscal position did get a bit better, that all would not be lost for Labour in 28 or 29. But I think most people would accept that if Labour do tank in 2026, the shattering and the confidence of Scottish Labour would be such that perhaps they wouldn't be up for the fight in 28, 29. I mean, I suppose there's an obvious question, is that how does Starmer actually view Scotland? We know how he would view it in electoral terms. It's all about the arithmetic. It's perfectly straightforward. But does he have a feel for the politics? Does he think that it fits in? Again, I would put the point, it's because of the lack of anchors that there is essentially no strategy. I mean, if Brown was the Prime Minister, he would instinctively get that you have to try and march and tune. He would instinctively ensure that maybe perhaps decisions that he was taking wouldn't make life more problematic for his party north of the border. A lot of people say that Blair didn't get Scotland. I don't think that's actually true. I think he did, but he just took the view, I would be as well just keeping out of it. But he understood the dimension and the interrelationship between the party north of the border and the party south. I've interviewed Starmer twice on what we could call constitutional politics, and it was perfectly clear to me that he was not at all conversant in any of the history from the Labour governments in the 70s legislating not once but twice for devolution of the Constitutional Convention, Labour taking forward the Constitutional Convention proposals in 97. He just kept mouthing stuff about federalism. And I wasn't even convinced he understood federalism. So I suppose the obvious point here is that we've decided he's got no ideology. We've decided that he's got no real anchors. So it's hardly a surprise that he has no plan for Scotland.
I mean, you said it, Bernard, and there's very little I disagree with there. I'm not shocked by your account of those interviews, again, because that sort of detail is, if it's not about human rights law in that period, Keir Starmer wasn't really, or Arsenal, Keir Starmer wasn't really paying attention. What you can say about Keir Starmer, and maybe in time this will look like a triumph, or it will look like the complacency of a leader who wasn't up to it or didn't have the skill set or interest to do it himself. But he either delegates or subcontracts, delete as applicable, depending on sympathy, entire swathes of what he thinks or what his Labour Party thinks and how it conceives of issues to other people. Now, on Scotland, that has been to Anas Sarwar, Ian Murray, and at times Gordon Brown, although when Gordon Brown did his big constitutional commission, even before it was published, I was getting calls from inside Keir Starmer's office saying, from certain people inside there saying, this stuff is crazy. Don't worry, we're not going to do any of it. Which, was not, there's a vignette in the book about, there being yet another report saying that, Labour weren't interested in Brown's constitutional commission and the House of Lords wasn't going to be abolished, and Gordon Brown rings a shadow cabinet minister, and there are no pleasantries as ever with Gordon. He just barked down the phone, what's going on? And I think, but it's all very telling, when Keir Starmer needs a solution on, or needs something to say about the Constitution, he goes to Gordon Brown. The politics of Scotland are delegated to Ian Murray and Anas Sarwar. Now, all of that is fine. And at times it's worked and at times it hasn't worked, and it may yet work very well for the Labour Party. But as you say, it's not the same as leadership. It's not political leadership. It's not a coherent political project. Even if he is surrounded by people who are Scottish, live in Scotland, if he's in regular communication with Scots who feel this stuff very deeply and understand it instinctively, in the case of Gordon Brown, if you were to have him on this podcast and you were to ask him a series of questions about Scotland, I'm not entirely sure what he would say or think, and that probably is a problem.
Yeah, here's another example of it, Patrick, and so on. Throughout the tortuous Brexit years and so on, and the question of what is the Labour Party's position on Brexit, all the agitation about, are we a party of Remain? Are we a party of a people's vote? And so on and so on. Well, now eventually Starmer gets to the place where he is talking about, yes, we need a second referendum on Brexit. At no point in your account or in Tim Shipman's account of the Brexit years and so on, or in any other account I read, is there the slightest indication that it ever occurs to Keir Starmer that it is quite difficult to oppose a second referendum on Scottish independence while calling for a second referendum on Brexit. Now, I can understand that why, viewed from London, Brexit seems to be much, much more important, but that is, to some extent, just simply a question of perspective. It is the fact that it never seems to cross his mind, or indeed anybody else's mind, that is perhaps interesting and salutary.
No, I don't think so. And again, this is in spite of, who is the aide Keir Starmer spends most time with? It's not Morgan McSweeney. It's a woman called Jill Cuthbertson, his head of office, who is literally Scottish. I'm not entirely sure he, beyond political positioning, beyond saying, oh, Scotland, that's where we're going to put the headquarters of GB Energy, etc. This stuff I don't think looms particularly large in his head. And I guess that's a key difference with past Labour governments who always had that, in terms of their political definition, formation, self-identity. New Labour in particular were, driven by, Scots of the, old and Enlightenment schools. I'm also thinking, you mentioned a second referendum. the points at which Keir Starmer, in opposition, deigns to talk about the SNP or Scottish politics beyond saying we won't have a second referendum. I mean, what does he say in 2023 after local elections? He says we won't have a coalition. What he does say, he said we're open to some sort of deal with the Liberal Democrats, the point of which was to we're open to a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, a cooperation with the Liberal Democrats should we get into government, but under no circumstances will we do a deal with the SNP. Which was interesting, right? The SNP in Scotland only feature as a question of electoral arithmetic and how Scotland and its politics are perceived in England tactically and strategically at elections. It's not sort of, we have a moral objection to the SNP or, while we may appear to agree on economics, theirs is the politics of grievance. I mean, privately, Morgan McSweeney likens the SNP, liken them to sort of Trump, the sort of build a wall tendency. And that is, one of the many private remarks we're familiar with from Morgan McSweeney. But, I don't think Keir Starmer would ever be capable of sort of articulating his opposition to Scottish nationalism, if it exists in principle like that. So, yeah.
We've had a good run at this for, I think now 51 minutes, Patrick, but perhaps as one final question, because Labour activists perhaps listening to this podcast, well, a number of them may well have left it about 20 minutes ago, given how depressed much of the content is for them. On the other hand, people in other political parties will be staying to the bitter end because they'll no doubt be cheered by all of this. I think probably, Alec and I have long agreed that this government in the UK sense will stand or fall by its ability to A, deliver economic growth, and B, for that economic growth to make a demonstrable improvement in public services. That is, I think, the long and the short of it. But given that we have gone over the Prime Minister's politics, given that we've gone over Morgan McSweeney's journey into this very influential position that he holds, but given that events are simply kicking this Prime Minister around on a day-to-day basis, the final question to you, is it salvageable?
Again, Bernard, I think it's the events question. A lot of it, so much of it will depend on things that are outside of Keir Starmer's control. And that sounds like a cop-out answer, but again, it will depend on whether he is politically deft, astute enough, whether, Morgan McSweeney and others can look at the, to use Blair's phrase, the kaleidoscope being shaken, where they can look at the prospect of war in Europe, and America in retreat, Britain having to spend more of its GDP on defence. All of these external shocks, I think, are going to be much more decisive. And then the electoral picture too. It may well be that the question is answered in 2 years' time in a Westminster hotel when the new Tory leader, Robert Jenrick, says to Nigel Farage, here are the terms of an electoral pact. But it will be up to Keir Starmer to respond to those challenges. And one thing I will say to his credit is doing the political thing in Labour politics so often means splitting the difference. It means uneasy compromise. It means staying up to 3 a.m. to agree a form of words that means nothing to anybody and satisfies nobody. Whereas Keir Starmer is capable of taking advice, taking a brief like a good barrister, and adapting hard and fast. It's whether he takes the right advice and is politically deft enough, and indeed whether his treasury lets him. So we'll see. It's certainly salvageable. I mean, look, the guy's got a majority of 170. No one will ever take that away from him. But it's tough, and it will require another run of incredibly good luck. It will require Morgan McSweeney's strategic nows to be proven right again, and it will require a lot of other people to make mistakes. Only this time it's the hard right of British politics and not the hard left. But it's happened before, so there's no reason why it can't happen again. So the jury's out. But if I learned anything right in this book, it's that you can bet against Keir Starmer, but often he will, despite himself, surprise you.
Okay, well, we shall wait and see. Patrick, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show and talking to us. The book, I remind listeners, is Get In, The Inside Story of Labour Under Starmer, published by the Bodley Head and written by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund. It's a tremendous account of the rise of both Starmer and McSweeney. Essential reading, I would suggest, if you want to understand our current political moment and where it came from. As to what happens next, well, indeed, we shall have to wait and see. But thank you very much indeed for joining us and to talk about some of these issues.